I'm Waddy Thompson, author of The Wise Guide to Winning Grants, and today I'd like to talk to you about how to prepare a convincing budget to go along with your grant proposal. All too often, we spend weeks polishing language, getting all the details right in the narrative, and then at the last minute, oops, we need a budget, let's throw some numbers together. But that's a mistake. There are some very good reasons why you need a good budget presentation. Funders have seen many budgets for projects similar to yours and know what is reasonable to expect in expenses and in income. And if there's something in yours that's not right, it'll set off red flag warnings to them. They frequently go from cover letter straight to the budget, simply because they know that the budget can be very telling in its details. Purpose of the budget is to express how the grant money will be spent, show how expenses will be covered by different income sources, and demonstrate to the funder that you have a thorough understanding of what it takes to carry out the project. That is the sum and total of what the budget's supposed to do, and it's very important that you do all of those things. So in preparing a budget, there are a number of things to consider. First off, who's the best person to create a budget? Your accountant or a financial person at your nonprofit? Well, they probably have access to the numbers, but they may not be very good at presenting it in a form that will make sense to the funder. I once worked at a place where the accounting department was very efficient and detail-oriented. The expense budget had literally over 40 lines. No funder wants to go through 40 lines to figure out what's going on. You might think the program director could figure out the budget. Well, the program director certainly knows what's going on, but she might not know what it cost. So it usually falls to the grant writer to pull information from both of those people and put it together in a form that will be most persuasive to the funder. You have to think about what level of detail to include or exclude. What's important? An expense should be there relative to the total budget. If you have a project with an $800,000 budget, a budget item of $60 is not really relevant and should probably be combined with something else. Then if there are exceptional expenses involved, such as money for an art exhibition or scholarship money that you're going to give away, those things definitely need to be itemized so that the funder can see them right away. Also think about, is this for a project or are you asking for operating funds? That means for your general operations. These will influence the level of detail that you include. An operating budget having much less detail. And also indirect expenses. Whereas a project will have certain amounts of overhead that are attributable to it. In an operating budget, your overhead is what you're including, what you're asking money for. So there are no indirect expenses for an operating budget. We'll talk about that later. So in putting together a budget, I like to think about the old mnemonic that was used about how to write a good newspaper article. Who, what, when, where, how, and why. I've been able to figure out how to express everything in numbers in the budget except the why, but I'm still working on it. But let's talk about the other headings today. The who is the personnel or consultants that are needed to do the job. Who will do the project? Who works in your organization if it's an operating budget? What are the direct and indirect expenses? When will it take place? To make a budget complete, it's always a good idea to put the grant period right on the top of the page, so there's no ambiguity. Where will it take place? Are there occupancy costs? Especially, are there any costs for space beyond those of your charity's regular office? The how is how you will carry it out, meaning what will be your income. Who's going to fund that? Who has already committed funding? These are all things you have to think about when you're completing a budget. So let's look at those one at a time. First of all, the who, the personnel. Who do you include? Well, in a project budget, you include everyone who's going to work on the project. You might think, well, does my executive director get included? Well, if she's working directly on the project, she does. She may only be spending a very small percentage of her time supervising the person who's actually doing the project, but that time of hers should be included. Frustratingly, you can virtually never include your fees or money for fundraisers. Funders don't want to fund that. Of course, in an operating budget, they are part of the general overhead, so they would be there. So when you're including someone, you want to know, so how much of their time should be included? I go to someone who works on a program and say, how much time are you spending on this project? And they're not sure. It's helpful to think about, since we have a 5-day week, 20% is equal to 1 day of work. So if the person is spending the equivalent of 1 full day of work per week throughout the grant period, then they're spending 20% of their time. So that's a good way to start thinking about it. Fringe benefits should also be included for all salary personnel, and that includes payroll taxes, health insurance, anything else that your nonprofit considers a fringe benefit. Hourly personnel should also be included, especially if there are any consultants who are being hired, particularly for a project. These include all kinds of non-salary personnel, consultants, an evaluator, and volunteer time. And later we'll talk about how to specifically to include your volunteer time. And you can format this to tell your story better. So let's look at some examples. So here's a project budget at the top of the page, and it shows each of the people who will be working on it. And as I said before, the executive director may be spending just a little bit of time supervising it, but that 10% of her time is included. So this is 10% of her salary. So that means that she's making actually $80,000 as her salary, and 10% of it, $8,000, is included here. The program director is obviously spending much more time, but you can see the bulk of the work is being done by the program officer, who's spending 75% of her time on the project. Non-salary personnel, instructors, and evaluator are listed separately below the salaried personnel. So at a quick glance, you can see that the salaried personnel and the non-salaried personnel are almost the same amount. In an operating budget, you might group several people, like administrative personnel. There are 3 of them at this charity, and altogether, they make $195,000. The what and where are the direct expenses. You're going to want to group the activity together by similar things. For instance, rent and utilities are very similar and go together. Your office insurance is another thing that might be grouped together with that. Are you giving any money away as a re-grant, meaning you take the grant from the foundation and then you give it away to someone else? Travel and per diems frequently require a good bit of detail, especially in government grants. They can be very fussy about what travel is involved. And then how you communicate with the outside world, whether that's postage, FedEx, telephone, internet, those things also could be grouped together. Supplies, any special equipment for your project, along with printing, website, outside space needs, and PR and marketing. Those are just some of the examples of what goes under direct expenses. Some of those expenses will be things that are allocated. Just like we said, the executive director is spending 10% of her time. So that's an allocation. But you might also have an allocation of the annual fee on or rental for your photocopier. You're probably going to want to include some contingency or miscellaneous. Never use the word miscellaneous. Funders really dislike that. Contingency is a little more palatable to them, usually 1 to 10%. I had a program officer once insist that if she came in to her board with a proposal that showed 10% contingency, they would not even consider it. And so we compromised, and I asked for 9% and got it. But it was a tough fight. So when you're making this budget, should you inflate the cost to make it look like you need more money? Or should you deflate the cost to make it look like you're efficient? Or should you give what the real costs are? Well, I hope it's obvious you should give the real cost. One of the reasons for that is you're going to have to report on this project eventually. And those are going to be real costs in your report. If you've inflated the cost and don't spend all the money, it looks like you didn't do the job. If you deflated the cost and you overspend what you said originally, it looks like you didn't know what you were talking about. So, as much as you can, truthful, hard numbers are always the best way to go. Here's an example of the direct expense section of a grant budget. And so you can see rent, utilities, insurance have been grouped together. Down at the bottom, professional development and conference fees, which are all about enhancing your staff, have been listed together. When you put similar things together, it helps the funder sort of subtotal in their head and get an easy picture of what you're spending the money on. Indirect expenses are those which by definition are too difficult to attribute to any one project. They're composed of rent, utilities, office equipment, rental of equipment, insurance, things that you need for the general operations of your company. One way to determine how much of your indirect cost should be included in a project is to think first about how much of your personnel costs are in that project. For example, if your total personnel cost for your organization is $500,000 and your cost for this particular project is $100,000, then 20% of your personnel costs are going to this particular project. So therefore it would be logical that 20% of your rent, insurance, etc. would also go to this project. You only use indirect expenses in project grants. Government grants and indirect rates are a whole other kettle of fish, especially for federal grants. Federal grants usually require you to make application and go through an elaborate process before your official indirect rate can be determined. And of course, no double dipping. If you've listed the rental of your Xerox machine as a line item in your expense budget, then you can't also include the rental of that Xerox machine as part of your indirect cost. If your nonprofit has an audited financial statement, you'll find a page similar to this one near the back. You can see that program, administration, and fundraising expenses have been separated. If you add together the administration and fundraising expenses, those are your indirect expenses. So if you total them and divide them by the total of all expenses, you'll come out with your indirect rate. For example, look at the total expense line here. $91,000 in administration plus $47,000 in fundraising equals about $138,000, which divided by the $600,000 in total expenses comes out with 0.23. So your indirect rate here is 23%. Capital expenses are seldom included in operating or project budgets. The exception would be in a project budget where you have to purchase a piece of equipment specifically for that project. Then you would include it. Depreciation expenses usually are not included in expenses for projects, simply because you would have to figure out a way to cover them with income, which would just result in a larger allocation of operating expense. The when is as simple as just writing a date or a year at the top of your column. In this case, we're applying for a grant to be spent over 2 years. So it's broken down what will be spent in year 1 and what will be spent in year 2. And the precise calendar dates for those years could also be included. Here's the income side of that budget. And you'll see that in the first year and the second year we bring in about the same amount of money. But the expenses, which I note at the top of the page there, are very different, resulting in a $19,000 surplus the first year, which is okay because the second year we have a $19,000 deficit, and in the end it all balances out. For the how, the income, it's good to distinguish between amounts that are requested versus those that are already in the bank versus those that are pending proposals awaiting a resolution. I like to put the amount that I'm requesting from a particular funder first and label it as such. And keep in mind how that request relates to the total project costs. Few funders want to feel like they're shouldering a disproportionate amount of the total cost. Of course, your pending outstanding proposals will probably greatly exceed the budget because, let's face it, not every grant application is successful. But don't list all of them so that it makes it look like you're going to have a huge surplus. Instead, list the ones you think are most likely to come through and just enough of them to balance the budget. You may also find yourself allocating some grant income. For example, let's say you have a program budget of $200,000, but you've only identified a potential $180,000 in direct support of that project, leaving you with a $20,000 deficit. Rather than showing a $20,000 deficit, instead add $20,000 of your operating income that you are willing to allocate to this project. That's a good thing. It shows you're putting, so to speak, your own money into the project as well as the grant income. Matching grants and challenge grants can also be labeled so that funders know if their amount they give will have a more far-reaching effect. And in-kind income, donated goods or labor, are also important to include, and we'll talk later in this presentation about how to do that. So here in the top of the page is an example of a very modest grant proposal for $47,500. That's the entire project budget. And this particular application is going to the Smith Foundation, which we're asking them to give us $10,000. And then we show that Continental Airlines is giving us $2,500 in vouchers for airfare. And the Jones Family Foundation, we've already received their money of $10,000. And we have an application pending at the Community Foundation for $15,000. In addition, the participants in this particular program are going to pay in total $5,000 in fees. And that's how we come up to match the total expense for the project of $47,500. The example on the lower half of the page shows how different levels of detail tell a different story. So in the first one, we show that government income is $400,000, which is a very big number. It's also very non-specific. Where's that money coming from? That could raise a lot of questions in the funder's mind. But in the second column, we break that government down into $370,000 in a federal grant and $30,000 in a state grant. A breakdown like that can be particularly effective if one of the grants, especially if it were the federal grant in this case, has already been obtained. That would give the funder great confidence that the project would go forward. In-kind donations are donations of time or objects that are used for your programs. They're frequently a very vital contribution to an organization, especially new or small groups. And it's necessary to include them to demonstrate the true cost of your program. To assign value to volunteer time, simply think about how much you would have had to pay someone to do the same thing. And in the case of a consultant, I'm sure if you ask them, they'll be able to give you a number of what they would have had to charge you had they not been donating their time. The important thing with in-kind contributions is to balance them and include a line in both the income and expense categories so that it's clear what was given. Let's look at an example. Here's a budget for a small project by a community band. They have $5,000 that they pay to professional musicians, $2,500 they pay to community musicians, just as a basically cab fare, transportation. They're paying $750 to print their flyers and programs, $400 to mail it, $5,000 for administrative support, $650 to transportation, and $1,200 to rent the music. They are going to, even though it's a free concert, they're going to let people pay a premium to have reserved seats up front, and they expect to get $2,500 for that. They're asking the county foundation for $7,500. The local dry cleaner, Hudson Cleaners, has given them $2,500 as a sponsorship fee, and the River Fund Foundation is now considering a request of $3,000. So you can see what we're asking the county foundation for is almost half of the total. County foundation may think that's a very high proportion and puts a lot of pressure on them to come up with the money. But let's look at what happens when we add volunteer time in. So the shaded portion on the right is the same as on the previous page. And the column on the left, we've added in volunteer time. So you can see that we have added in $1,750 for ushers and setup crew. These are high school kids that are volunteering. And if we had to pay them minimum wage of about $9 or $10 an hour, this is what we would have paid them to do that. The marketing consultant is coming in at $4,000. And that's all donated. The printing of flyers and programs, $2,250, whereas before it was listed at $750. Well, that's because the good-hearted printer is donating most of the cost of the printing to us. Mailing remains the same. Administrative report remains the same. The rental of a truck for delivery is the same, and the music rental is the same. Now in the income section, you'll see that we've added to the funders that we had before $1,750 from the volunteer ushers and crew, the $4,000 that the marketing consultant is giving us, and the $1,500 that the big-hearted printer is donating. So now what we're asking the county foundation for is roughly a third of the total, which will probably be a much more palatable percentage to them. Occasionally, you will be asked to write a budget narrative. In order to put the project budget in the context of your organization's overall budget, reassure the funder about potential funding that you expect, explain major expense items, especially any exceptional items which otherwise might stick out like a big sore thumb. Here's an example. Staff will conduct the teacher training assisted by a consultant. The program evaluator will follow the program and write a report on its effectiveness, which we will share with funders. Participants will receive a small stipend, travel subsidy, and lunches each day of training. Printing a teacher's guide is the single largest non-personnel expense. So in that paragraph, we have briefly explained all of the expense items and shown how they relate to each other. Now let's look at the next paragraph, which talks about the income. 5 additional grant proposals have been submitted, all but one to new funders. Several board members are also expected to contribute through their family foundations toward this total. We are confident we will raise the remaining funds, Should the funds raised fall somewhat short of the goal, we can reduce or postpone the role of the evaluator to the following year. So here we've expressed our confidence that we will, one way or the other, get funding, and even mentioned what we'll do if, heaven forbid, all the funding doesn't come in. Simple footnotes can also be used on a budget, when a short explanation will do, to point out how a particular expense relates to a project and to comment on potential other funding. Here's the 2-year grant budget that we looked at before, with one significant change. If you look down the side toward the bottom, exhibition expenses now indicates that there is a footnote for that $40,000 that's spent in the second year. That could have been a big sore thumb that raised a lot of questions, but with our footnote, we have broken it down and explained exactly what it's being used for. Reporting is frequently the most overlooked part of the grant process, and of course it's the absolute most important part, because your report is your first step towards your next grant. In the budget, you're going to be asked to compare the actual results to your projected budget and explain significant changes, either with a footnote or in your narrative. In multi-year projects, you may need to revise your projections for the subsequent year if you need to. It's much better to modify your budget in advance than report on discrepancies. I once had a project that we had gotten a large grant for, and we were getting near the end of the grant period, and I hadn't really heard the program staff talking about all of the parts of the project yet. There was one thing that they were supposed to be doing, a professional development part, that I was pretty sure they hadn't done. And the grant was to be completed in 3 months. So I asked the program staff what was going on, and they said no, they hadn't gotten to it yet, and it was actually going to take them 9 more months to finish it. So I called up the program officer at the foundation and told her what our predicament was. She said, "That's absolutely fine. I understand that sometimes things don't go the way they go. But are you positive that an additional 6 months will be enough? Because I can give you 1 extension, but I can't give you 2. And I said, yes, we were confident that in an additional 6 months, that is 9 months from the date I called her, we would be done. And so she gave me the extension, my program staff finished the project, and we were able to report on a successful completed project. Here is an example again of our 2-year project, and this funder required an interim financial report at the 6-month period. So you can see I've presented year 1 and year 2 in the total exactly as they were before. And then I've shown on the side what we had spent as of 6 months, both in expenses and in income. And the fact that after 6 months there's a very large surplus of $83,000, that's fine, because we knew we were going to spend it all by the end. So thinking back over what we've talked about, the hallmarks of a good budget and a grant proposal is that, number 1, it's complete. Every possible expense has been included. The income is sufficient to carry out the project. Importantly, every item in the budget corresponds to something in the narrative, and vice versa. If a particular employee is mentioned in the narrative, you better be sure that that employee's salary occurs in the budget. The budget also answers questions that the funder might have. It doesn't provoke new questions. You can find an abbreviated version of this talk on my website, grantadvisor.com. Look in the resources section for a link to the budget article. At the end of that article, there's a link to a packet of sample budgets which you might find useful. For more information about grant writing, I encourage you to get my book, The Wise Guide to Winning Grants. It's available in paperback and ebook from all the major online vendors. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your grant.